Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to poet Ruben Quesada, author of Brutal Companion. Before I introduce you to Ruben, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So, again, today I am thrilled to introduce you to Ruben Quesada. Ruben is a poet, translator, and editor. He edited the award-winning anthology Latinx Poetics, Essays on the Art of Poetry. His writing appears in the New York Times Magazine, American Poetry Review, The Believer, and Harvard Review, among elsewhere. And his poetry collection, which we'll discuss today, Brutal Companion, won the Barrow Street Editors Prize. So, Ruben, welcome to Poet.
Hi, Radha. Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And I've loved your interviews. I've been watching them on your YouTube channel, and I can't wait to talk to you.
Oh, I'm so honored. So this book, you're the author of several collections, not just this book, Brutal Companion, which we'll talk about today. Um, where did this particular book start? How long did it take for you to complete it, start to finish? Maybe, give us a little window into the genesis of this work.
Sure. So the book was published in 2024, at the end of 24, and working backwards from then, uh, I knew the book was ready probably about a year and a half before that. I was about two-thirds of the way through, but I knew what I wanted in the book, and so I spent about a year and a half revising and just kind of playing with the order of the poems. And I didn't have very many poems left to write. I didn't write this book with a project in mind or like a central idea in mind. I'd been working on poems for many, many years before. In about 2013, I had this idea for a book project.
Mm.
I just graduated grad school in 2012. And so I had this idea for a book project that focused on ekphrastic poetry. So, ekphrastic poetry, poetic responses to artwork, have that process has always really spoken to me. It almost the artwork creates like an entryway for me to explore my imagination. And so I started writing ekphrastic poems about 2013. And as we got into, over the years, other projects kind of stepped in, and like the anthology. And so I had to put my poems kind of on break for a moment. And I finally went back to them during the pandemic. So, boy, I would say on and off for about a decade. I wrote all kinds of poems, and then eventually they just kind of came together. The ekphrastic and a number of other poems that are just more lyrical in nature. So yeah, it wasn't like a straight line. It was just a little bit of meandering, and I finally just got to a place where I thought, oh, I see something happening here. Let's see if I can put it out into the world.
Great. So, when you looked at the work during the pandemic, it sounds like most of it was there, and you started to write into maybe some of the themes that you discovered. Is that how it went, or?
Yeah, that sounds about right. So during the pandemic, I just before the pandemic, I started developing a relationship and online with a poet. Just it was someone I really admired, and we started trading poems. And we would just get online like this and read poems to each other, and then just kind of talk about them, like our motivation, what were we trying to get at, what were we trying to explore. And I found that the poems that, like the last few remaining poems that finally came into the book, I put out in 2018 as a little chapbook. But those really flourished into more during the pandemic. The other poet that I kind of had this exchange with is also a priest, and
Hmm.
so it felt like I felt liberated in some way, like I could confess
Hmm.
and just be more open in my work, and so over that time, about 2020 to 22. Um, that's when the poems really came together, and I had everything there. It was just a matter of just kind of filling in some gaps before I had a full manuscript.
Wow, that's so fascinating too, the way a certain type of companion in the process can become sort of the reader, the stand-in for the reader in a way. You know, it's like they're the recipient, they're the first recipient and first person to sort of play that role of receiving the work. And it's so powerful, I think, to have that palpable sense of someone receiving the work. So that's so interesting that that was part of the process for you.
Yeah, I know so many people whose partners are writers, and they say, "Oh, this is who I share, who sees my work first and shares my work." I've never been that kind of person to just like join a writing group or or be so open with my work. It's just I don't know. I I feel like my work is private in that way, at least during the process. And I think this relationship with this religious poet really just unlocked something that made me just feel like it was okay to share.
Mm,
Um, yeah, I don't know if I would have been able to do it otherwise.
mm. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, would you like to read a little sample for us and we can keep talking?
Sure. Um, let's see. I'm going to read a poem called Genesis. I
Mm,
thought that would be kind of appropriate. Um, so this is a type of Ars Poetica. Uh, so I thought Genesis would be an appropriate title.
mm,
Even the province of truth must be stitched. Start with a pattern, a needle and thread to sew the empty sleeves of a sentence, a hole in the hull of a hemistick. We'll begin by weaving a heroic couplet with the tip of our tongues, then spit and spin fringe for flair. Thread a loose sentence, darn it, the slip stitch of subject and predicate through ribbed velveteen. Then set tender Baroque buttons on the cuff and press an adverbial crest over the breast. What is the point predicated on subject and verb? The smell of your bronzed skin in my mouth, a periodic splinter on the road of my spine along the wall. The collar curls a path to trace the past as the hem unravels.
mm. The
That's a lot of fun
sonics
to
are
read.
so exquisite in that. I love it so much. In fact, because of I think listeners and readers of the book are going to sense the intricacy of the things that are intersecting in this work, right? So in this particular poem, it's the writer's consciousness coupled with this relational kind of devotional even sense of that relationship. And like you were saying, there's this religious nature, right, of the person that you were in conversation with in these in the development of the poem. So I'm curious maybe if we can jump ahead a little bit to a question I was going to ask later, but I'm curious about the formal choices and stylistic elements that emerged as sort of the signature moves for this particular book. And how consciously did you cultivate a consistent voice or aesthetic? I mean, I've read the book, so I know not all of the poems have this level of richness. But yeah, can you talk to us a little bit about the stylistic choices in the book?
Sure. So there are a number of poems that are ekphrastic poems, and so those were really driven by the different forms of art that I was watching, or I was observing. Um, and beyond the artwork, it was really important to me to um, uh, to focus on the music of the line, of the syntax and diction. So regardless of the poem's kind of impetus, um, I've always been interested in the sonic quality of a poem. So even if a poem isn't in a particular form, where some of my poems are, they're either syllabic, um, or there's a poem where I created a form. It's 10 lines, 10 syllables each line for a total of 100 syllables. Um, and so formal style and technique is something I really love. I teach it sometimes, and it's something that, as a young poet, I avoided. I resisted it strongly because I thought something was being imposed upon me that I wasn't ready for and I didn't want. And it wasn't until I left grad school and I'd been teaching for a while that I started to revisit form. And syllabics is probably the most accessible, right? It's something that is just kind of inherent to how we naturally speak. It's already in the ear, but accentual syllabic verse has always been a challenge for me, for so many people.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I was prepping for a class that I wanted to teach on form that something unlocked, and suddenly I thought, oh my goodness, it's really easy to do this. Uh, um, Spanish is my first language. I grew up speaking Spanish, um, all the grammar and mechanics that I picked up were from school, and our school systems here aren't the greatest necessarily, and so there was so much that I think I'd been missing, that the value of or the weight of a consonant sound or a vowel sound. Just I wasn't attuned to it enough to really feel confident in being able to play with form. So a lot of the poems in this collection are syllabic, um, uh, and you know, I think about Gregory Orr's essay, "The Four Temperaments and the Forms of Poetry," which is an essay where he creates like this um, uh, a way to examine a poem, and he breaks it down into these four categories: story, structure, music, and imagination. And he says that the most ideal poem has these four qualities in harmony. And so I think about that a lot when I'm putting my poems together. And in this collection, because there were so many poems that spanned so many years, when I was kind of in a different headspace, some of the tone in some of them I think is just like is unfamiliar to me now. Like I read some of these poems and I think, like, what was it? What was happening that led me to write this? It was so long ago, and so there are some moments in this collection that where the poems just feel a little bit looser. But I think it makes the other poems that really are attuned to sound and structure and form so much more, I think, resonant. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that you're pointing out this sort of the modulation, right, that happens between, highly, more highly stylized, however you want to put it, the very dense or, sonic, syllabic work, and, something that's a little bit looser. And how a collection can move between those. It doesn't have to land fully on one side or the other in order to function as a cohesive whole.
That's right. It's funny. I just started using these post-its that come in like these different gradient colors, and I started using them to mark my book where as where I'm going to read or what I'm going to read. And I went through yesterday. I gave a reading last night somewhere, and so I went through yesterday, and I thought, okay, let me just see which ones I really want to read. I don't have a lot of time. And so I marked a number of them. And as I was reading them aloud, I began to pick up a pattern of a really clear, like, through line of thematic things running through. And the funny thing is these poems are from various sections from beginning to end. So, they're being strung together by other poems, which are probably a bit looser.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Would you like to read another example, maybe one that is in that looser category, or what's your favorite poem to read?
Um, I think my favorite poem to read is a poem about my mother. It's about her gardening.
Hmm.
Um, and it's also really, I mean, it was a lot of fun to write because my mother loved to garden when I was growing up. There were flowers and plants, I mean, everywhere in the yard and in the house, and even now, my mother's retired and lives in like a senior living center, but she has a balcony where she can sit and look out, and you can almost the street is almost completely obscured by plants. It's just in her blood, and so I wrote this poem called "My Mother is a Garden." She plants razzleberry fringe flowers in the backyard as the chartreuse golden feather farewell next door. Before my birth, she's acquired by the United States. Coerced by the American zodiac dream, she fled to Los Angeles. Decades later, she still withholds from speaking English, and only fertile names of flowers have taken root. She is luminous, her hair a blackish gray against the philodendron parted long. I lose her in the shade of overgrown impatiens hanging onto the hillside behind the house. The horizon undulates with barberry and nettles, deer grass waves of silver. Years have passed, not speaking with my mother, but today I surprise her with a visit. In the glow of the window, I watch her tend to her roses and notice that I have taken the shape of her hips.
Mm.
Oh,
I can,
yeah.
I can, you say balcony and the impatiens and, that the hillside behind. And, I know you grew up right on the West Coast, and LA is important in this collection, and other places play into the poems here as well. How does place, what does place mean to these poems? And do you think of it, is it origin story? Just setting.
Yeah, that's a great question. In my first collection, it was all about place. I mean, it was all I wrote about was like growing up in Los Angeles. I grew up about 10 miles southeast of downtown LA in a small little city in southeast LA. And so I wrote a lot about that landscape. It was like an origin story about just growing up there. I left LA when I was about 30. And since leaving, I haven't moved back. So it's going to be 20 years next year. And so since leaving, I've written about different places I've lived in. So I spent about 5 years in West Texas. I lived in a city called Lubbock. So I wrote, there's a Lubbock poem in this book. And there's some poems about Dallas. The places I've occupied certainly find their way into the book. There might be one or two poems in this book about my younger self, but primarily these poems are about the recent past. My view of Chicago. I think there's a poem in here where I have like almost like it was. I actually wrote that poem when I lived in Texas just before moving here, kind of romanticizing the city. It's where Carl Sandburg is from, Gwendolyn Brooks. There's so much richness of poetry in Chicago. But I thought back to the early 20th century to, Carl Sandburg's Chicago poems came out in 1916, 110 years ago. And just to think about the number of working class people that really, I think, dominated the city back then, in a way that I think we would look back and think like these people were homeless or just so poverty stricken, just because there wasn't a lot of infrastructure, or at least what we think of infrastructure today. And so I imagine these romanticizing what it was like to live in this kind of rural Chicago. And so I write a lot about just kind of seeing that kind of landscape in my head and what that might be like, not just in Chicago, but the Southwest, right? Like I was in South, I was kind of in I was in West Texas, but still part of the Southwest. It's a weird little kind of pocket in the U.S. But I also write about Los Angeles in a more, I think, nostalgic way. There's so much that's changed in the last 20 years in Los Angeles that I don't recognize it anymore. There was a particular bridge in Los Angeles on a street called Sixth Street, and this bridge goes over the LA River. And the Los Angeles River is, it just looks like a little stream in the middle of like a giant concrete, waterway. But the Sixth Street Bridge was torn down and rebuilt into this gorgeous structure. It's called the Sixth Street Viaduct, and it has these beautiful arches. They're all in car commercials and all these. You'll see it everywhere. You wouldn't know it unless you actually knew what that was. But LA has just changed into such a visually marvelous location. And when I was growing up there, it seemed like every few years they would just knock something down and just rebuild it brand new. And moving here to Chicago, where there's so much history, and history is preserved in their structures and in the homes. The house I live in now is like 120 years old. It's just incredible to just think about the history of different places, and so I try to capture that in the places that I've occupied, and responding to those places in a way that sometimes is nostalgic, or sometimes it's just like the poems about Lubbock, or just kind of being very honest about what this place really is. It's not always pleasant.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting when you were saying, Chicago, the structures, the history, and I'm thinking, well, you were just talking about the structures of poems and the history of, syllabics, and, so is the architecture and, living someplace that celebrates that longevity of form. somehow like infused into the work. Maybe that's a stretch, but
Oh, I love that. I love that. I might have to borrow that. I really do like, that's so interesting though. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Um, yeah, I mean, the poems that I've written about Chicago, yeah, I just comes to mind. There are several Chicago poems here about either Navy Pier or different neighborhoods, and in them, there's always some historical element. Uh, yeah, I think that poetry just generally, but either its form or content, when it engages history in some way, I think is so valuable. I was thinking about like I remember the first time that really struck me was listening to a poet named Francine J. Harris. She was giving a reading at the Poetry Foundation here in Chicago, and I just thought, wow, that's really captivating. There's so much like activism or like exploration for social justice that I could do in my work, and so that became a real catalyst.
that's wonderful. Would you like to read one of the Chicago poems, or is that
Oh, sure, yeah, I'll do that. I'd love to. Um, This is one that I think really there are a lot of land of recognizable places in the city that I mention here. I read this last night at a reading, and there was another poet that was reading named Angelique Zobitz,
hmm,
uh, and she said, "Oh, I have a poem about Chicago that I'm gonna read," here in Chicago, when someone asks where you are or where you live, you either give them the neighborhood or the intersection of the streets where you live. And this poem is set at the intersection of the poem that Angelique was her poem was about.
wow?
I didn't tell she doesn't. I didn't say anything to her about it, but it was so strange to hear her perspective of this neighborhood or this environment, and it was slightly similar,
What a
like there's a
cool sync.
darkness there.
Yeah, what a cool synchronicity.
Yeah. So this is called The Haunting of Uptown Chicago. I've started to see shadows, and they've become more frequent, tall and thin with long faces. The sun is far from rising. Storefronts are still decorated for Halloween. I hurry down the street, my head down against the wind. Is someone standing outside of your window? Across the street, a shadow begins to follow me on the way to the train. The wisdom of owls ignore everything. Constellations unfold above. I push past turnstiles on time to board. The morning fog is thick and heavy like wet wool. The train passes Graceland Cemetery. I can't tell if this is real. I haven't slept in 2 days. My weekend has started to overstay its welcome. At the next stop, a bearded man in a white shirt and black tie enters. He sits and holds a Bible in his lap. At the next stop, he moves to the door. I am facing him. He undoes his tie. Streetlights turn the hair on his chest and skin the color of amber. He tugs at his pocket, and I watch his erection settle to one side. A wet spot forms at the base of his zipper. He looks up at me and doesn't break his stare. Looking out above the Chicago River, the train jerks and I turn away, not recognizing myself in the reflection. I laugh, splitting the silence.
Mm. So many surprises in in that poem. And I'm just really struck by how, I mean, we often think about the attentiveness that one might have out in like a natural landscape, right? Oh, nature calls to us, but cities have their own uh quality of attentiveness and the details that come in, and oftentimes they're unbidden, right? They're there. And um, you know, it's not a first person poem, but the speaker of the poem, the poet, is so present in that sense. So I really appreciate that kind of attentiveness.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun to just think about like different details. I think about William Carlos Williams a lot, and his ideas of like he was so focused on images, on things. What did he say? Like no idea, but in things. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, spectacular poems come from noticing in that sense. So I wonder if I can ask a question maybe about some of the work that you've done that isn't poetry, but poetry related. So you edited the celebrated anthology Latinx Poetics, Essays on the Art of Poetry, before this collection came together. Is there anything about having edited that anthology, looking at thinking about craft across so many poets' work, that changed how you approached writing poems for
Mm.
this book or just generally?
That's a really good question. The anthology is it contains so many different ideas about poetry and approaches to poetry. Um, the anthology itself is about 2 dozen essays that were written for the book. So they were uh, original works about either how a poet came to poetry or what they expect from poetry or how they compose their own poetry. And it made me think about, I mean, it kind of made me a little self-conscious to think about like what it is that these other poets are seeing on the page that I may not capture or I may not be able to see for myself. And I think it really influenced the way in which I organize my lines on the page. So it had it had an impact on the visual layout of my work. The chapbook that came out right before this was was formatted in a way that the poems were these justified, unpunctuated blocks of text, so that it just looked like a perfect square or rectangle. And um, uh, and the poems in Brutal Companion are they're all over the page. They're short lined. There are a few prose poems, but it made me think a lot more about what the line is doing, how the white space on the page can really say something by not by just holding space. So I think that anthology just made that the putting that anthology together just made me more aware of the editorial process in my own work. I think I'm much more sensitive to that now, and I'm really happy about it because not only for my own work, but as you mentioned, I do I do other editorial work. And I think being able to have a broader view or a broader sense of what someone or of what a poet believes a poem should either look like or sound like was really helpful in solidifying my own thoughts about the work, but also being open to other possibilities that I hadn't considered.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I also work in other editorial capacities, professionally. And I find it so valuable to have that perspective that, first of all, we can never be our own editors on some level. And secondly, we can kind of get good at it. By being more thoughtful, and that being, I think there's this illusion when you're a young writer that if you put too much thoughtfulness into the work, it will be ruined. Then the magic is gone. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that anymore. I think that the more thoughtful we are, maybe not in the generative phase, but the more thoughtful we are in that revision, of the single poem, the constructing of the manuscript, it only makes the work better. So I really love that project was sort of that, plus these other capacities that you are working in. So speaking of editorial processes, did the book change much once it got to the publisher? So Barrow Street Editors Prize. Yeah, tell me a little bit about how that was.
Yeah, it was really exciting to learn that that Barrow Street wanted to publish the book, and there was one main editor that was kind of like my liaison to the other editors that are working for Barrow Street. So uh, they asked me to go through the book and just be sure about like, the organization. And they said, is this the order that you want the poems in? And I said, yeah, I think this is how I want it. And so they said, okay, well, they one of the editors looked at it and did a few things to it and sent it to me and said, this is how we think it should be. And so in comparing the two, there was very little difference. There were just a few poems. I would say maybe a handful of poems that just they wanted them to be in a different place because the content somehow resonated with something else that was near it, and so they wanted it moved, which totally made sense to me. I mean, that's something that I certainly look for when I'm reading a collection. Right? Like I want it to. I think about like ringing a bell. When that poem just like rings and I move on to the next one, I'm hoping that it's the tone carries over in some way. And so their feedback in moving poems around was really helpful. Then they asked me they said, do you have any more poems? And I did, as many of us do. And so I sent them about like a dozen poems. And I said, here you go. And from that dozen, they picked maybe like 3 or 4 and said, we think these would fit in there. Let's move these into the collection. And then, I'd been writing new work, and as I was writing or as I was organizing these poems and reading through, there were ideas that reminded me of other things that I started working on or I was currently working on. And there's one poem in here that I probably wrote like, I don't know, like days before I had to turn the final manuscript in. And it just kind of came to me, and it was great, and it worked out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what I love about that is just the sense that, editors often are open to new work coming in, right? So, I think some of us can get really caught up in, okay, well, I want this to be perfected. I'm going to perfect the manuscript before I even think of sending it out. And yes, I mean, it needs to be pretty well done. It can't be half baked. But on the other hand, the dynamic nature of writing, of course, you're going to be writing new poems. Of course, you're going to think, oh, you know, I love this new thing I wrote, and oh my gosh, it would totally fit. But will the editor accept it? And sometimes there is room for that.
Yeah, they were so open. They were so open to any suggestions and ideas that it's different. It's different working with like on an anthology and working with an editor in that way versus a more creative project. It just I felt really taken care of. Like I felt like if I had any kind of question at any point that I could ask, and like there were no stupid questions, and it was just great. It was a really good experience. It was a really good experience. I had a good time.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, and it's a great book. So it
Oh, thank you so
resulted
much.
in it resulted in just this wonderful book that we can all enjoy now. So speaking of process and moving forward and getting into new things, so what's next for you?
Um, I decided to take on like a book project, and so I've been exploring this mythological figure from Central America. My family's from Costa Rica, and so my grandmother told me this story about this figure that would come out at night and abduct people if they were out or up too late. You know, it was her way of trying me to get to bed, scaring me to bed. So I'm trying to write a poem about this figure, and kind of putting this mythological figure in a more contemporary space, because it's a character, a figure that was created hundreds of years ago, and so I'm refashioning this character as a flight attendant in the 1960s, and we follow her life every year. Yeah,
Wow. Wow, I love that.
it's a lot of fun.
That sounds fabulous. So maybe we'll end on that. Is there anything else that how can people find you? What would you like? Obviously they should go get the book if they don't have it already. But where else can you be found if you want to be found?
Sure. I left the majority of social media in January of this year, and so now I'm only on Substack, which someone said that is still social media, and it just doesn't feel the same as social media does. But you can find me at Substack at Ruben Quesada, and my website rubenquesada.com is currently being refreshed. But I do have a website that's just my first and last name all together. Or you can just Google me and find some of my work online.
Fabulous. Well, Ruben, what a pleasure. Congratulations
Thank
again on this
you.
great book.
Thank you so much for having me, Radha. This was so fun.
My pleasure.